I'm going to ask you a question, and depending upon your age, you may or may not be able to answer it. Where were you when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded? Now, if you're really, really old like me, I could ask you the question, where were you when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? Or a few years later, when Robert Kennedy was assassinated? Or right around that same time when Martin Luther King was assassinated? I bet all of you can have, if you were born or living at that time, some type of vivid memory of that moment. And even in more recent years, where were you when the Twin Towers came tumbling down? Historical events, especially tragic historical events, have markers in our mind. They're things that we remember, things that we will focus on for all of our lives as we even head into eternity. But then I'm going to ask you another question. Where were you when you first found out about the pandemic? Maybe where were you when you heard for the first time about the word COVID-19? Or maybe even remember that it had another word and it talked about the coronavirus, and even longer at one time, the novel coronavirus. Where were you when you heard about that? Now I can answer all of those questions for RFK, MLK, JFK, the Twin Towers, the Challenger. I can answer all of those with precision because I was old enough for all of them and because it was such a historic and tragic event for each and every one. But here's the reality. I don't know for sure when I first heard about COVID. I'm not certain when I understood fully that we had a pandemic upon us. Now, there's one thing I do remember. I was recording podcasts with Mark Clifton in one of my podcasts called Revitalize and Replant. And right after a call from his employer, and his employer said, you're to go home and cancel all travel. Now, that was the first time that I could remember the impacts precisely upon someone. And he had actually been to an NBA basketball game the night before, where before the game started, they stopped the game and told everyone to leave the auditorium, to leave the Coliseum because of COVID. So I do remember that, but that could not have been the first time that I ever heard of COVID. Where was I when I first heard of COVID? This has been such an unusual season. It has been such an extraordinary season. It's been like anything in my long life that I have any recollection. It's a time that will always stand out, but the beginning point does not have the precision. And so it is that COVID has affected us in so many ways. And even though we cannot precisely remember the beginning, we may not have a very clear marker on the end. It could be when your church regathers. It could be when you took off the mask and said, I don't need this anymore. Or it could be something else. But it's different than anything we have experienced. Being shut up in a house is okay for me because I'm an introvert. But looking at the damage that was caused to businesses and those that were hurt dramatically economically and those that closed, and even more importantly, people who were sick and people who lost their lives. The tragedy and the devastation was unmistakable. And yet I don't remember the precision with which this began. I'm going to try to give you a marker in my presentation right now. I'm going to try to give you a marker of a new beginning. The title is simply The Post-Quarantine Church Leading from the Inside Out. And what I mean by that, we're going to talk about the post-quarantine church, but we're going to talk about what it means to lead from the inside out. I will be talking about 4 things that are markers, and then I'll talk about 4 things that are potential solutions for this. So follow along with me as we begin to look at this incredible time in the context of another incredible time. And it was when the first church began. You know the story. The story was about the church at Jerusalem. Peter had just preached a sermon on Pentecost. Thousands came to the Lord. Many believers followed Christ. And then the first church began to form. After the first church began to form, we began to see some of the characteristics of that church. And though I know that you've heard Acts 2:42 through 46 and 47 many times. I want us to look at it again, maybe in a unique context, particularly the context in which we find ourselves today. For many of us, this passage is not only descriptive, it is prescriptive. It not only tells us what happened, it gives us an idea of what should happen today. Now let's just pick up, and I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. Let's just pick up in Acts 2, beginning in verse 42. All the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. A deep sense of awe came over them all, and the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders. And all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity, all the while praising God and enjoying the goodwill of all the people. And each day, the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. Obviously, a unique moment, the beginning of the first church. As a matter of fact, if you want to see the importance of the local church in the context of the New Testament, understand that its beginning point is here at Acts 2:42, and it goes all the way through Revelation 4. For any of us that minimize the importance of the local church, the Bible would say very much contrary. The local church is critical. The local church is God's plan A, and he does not have a plan B until he returns. So when we begin to get this first description of the church in Jerusalem, yes, we're getting a great description, but in many ways, we're getting a great prescription. Now, we're going to come back to this passage in just a moment, but for now, I want us to see 4 markers before we get to 4 leadership approaches from the inside out. 4 markers, 4 leadership approaches from the inside out. Let's look at the markers that we are presently experiencing in the quarantine. Marker number 1, 20 to 30% of attendance is gone. Different studies, some have shown 20%, some have shown as high as 30%. And it looks like in many ways that this is going to be a sustained number, because even in the churches that have been regathered for several months, that number is holding pretty steady. 20 to 30% are gone. Now, who are these people that are gone? These are people who were practicing the spiritual discipline of gathering and have gotten out of that discipline. Now, note what I just said. They were practicing the spiritual discipline of gathering. Many times when we talk about spiritual disciplines, we think about what? Prayer, fasting, reading the Bible, serving others. How often do we realize that gathering together for worship is a spiritual discipline? When you read Acts 2:42 through 47, go through and see how many times you see the word together. And all the believers, verse 44, met together in one place. Verse 45, they worshiped, this verse 46, they worshiped together at the temples. And so we go through here and we begin to see that together is very important in the early church, that the gathering was important. The worship gathering was important. We can't minimize that. We cannot suggest that, I've heard this so many times, the church is not the building, it's the people. Yeah, that's biblically true. But you know what the people do? They gather. And whether you call it a building or whether it happens to be out in a field or under a tree, it's when people gather that it's the church that is gathered. And now 20 to 30% of them are gone. That's marker number 1. Now, we're finding this is true in most contexts. Obviously, there are exceptions, but in most contexts, in most geographies, most countries, we're seeing that whatever the 2019 attendance was, 20 to 30% as a midpoint, as a median, are no longer there. Now, your church may be an exception. Your church may have everybody back in attendance. Your church may be over the amount of 2019, or it could be significantly under, such as 30 or 40 or 50%. But the midpoint, the median is 20 to 30% are gone. Now, where are they? Or maybe a better way to ask this question is, who are they? Who are these people that are gone? Who are these people that got out of the spiritual discipline, the habit of gathering? A large number, we've come to find, are what I would call cultural Christians. These cultural Christians are people who are Christian in name only. In 2019 and before, these Christians identified themselves as believers, or they identified themselves as belonging to a specific local church because they wanted to be culturally accepted, maybe for business reasons, maybe for political reasons, maybe for mere social acceptance. They identified as Christians or as church members or part of a church because it was the culturally accepted thing to do, and they wanted to be culturally accepted. But here's what they found out. During 2020, when many, in fact, most churches were not gathered, they found out that they could do just fine without being a part of a church. They found out that being Christian in name only didn't have to exist. They simply could go away, and they didn't even have to claim the name of Christ or identification with the church. Those cultural Christians used to make up a significant portion of our churches, and even though that number has been declining over the years, it declined precipitously during the pandemic. And now 20 to 30% are gone. That's one of the markers. Now, this next one is similar to it, but a little bit different. Another 15% have moved from 3 or twice a month attending to once a month. They've moved from 3 times a month to twice a month to more like once a month. The once a month attenders are the largest group of attenders in our churches today, at least in this early stages post-pandemic or post-quarantine. This group of people, let's just put it in perspective. Let's say that they were twice a month before the pandemic, and then they went to once a month. Now, let's put this into very simple terms. Let's say that you have a church that has 200 in attendance, and all of those 200 in attendance and average attendance are coming twice a month. So basically, you got 400 people in the church, and they're coming half the time. So that attendance is 200. If they all moved, I know it's a ludicrous example, but if they all moved from twice a month to once a month, what would happen? The attendance would be cut in half. As a matter of fact, before COVID, the number one reason for attendance decline in churches was less frequent attendance. Well, you got two things going on, markers number 1 and markers number 2. And marker number 1, you've got 20 to 30% of the people who are completely gone. And in marker number 2, you've got another roughly 15% who have now moved to once a month only. And what we're trying to find out is, are these once a monthers moving in? Or are they on their way out completely? I fear it may be the latter, but we'll see as we continue to do more study here. So first marker, 20 to 30% are gone. Second marker, another 15% have moved to once a month. Now, let me give you another marker that I think, put in perspective, is pretty good news. And this other marker is what I call the blank slate. Now, what do I mean by blank slate? Well, blank slate is just what it sounds. It means that there is a piece of paper or a board or some type of marker board, something that is totally clean and you can write on it. What we are saying as the church regathers, even though there are fewer people gathering, what we're seeing for at least a season is a higher receptivity among churchgoers to change. Now, my guess is, if you church leaders who may be viewing this right now, my guess is that many of you have had a lot of challenge leading churches to change. I mean, it is increasingly difficult. I wrote a book many years ago called Who Moved My Pulpit? And it was based upon the little book called Who Moved My Cheese in terms of the thesis, but it was this: change in a church is incredibly challenging. But here's the good news with marker number 3. For many church members in the entire congregation, there is a blank slate mentality. We have been through so much that we are ready to start over again. We're ready for you, leader, to tell us what we need to do to move forward. We know that things have changed, that things will never be the same again. We get that. We are ready to move forward in God's power. Now, how long will that window of change receptivity be open? I don't know. But I am encouraging all leaders, seeking God in prayer to lead your church to change that you may have been hesitant to do so in 2019 and before. This is the opportunity, this is the open door to move your congregation to a state where it can be ready for healthy growth for the future, the blank slate. And so one of the things that I'm just recommending is again and again, think about where you wanted to go 2019 and before, and maybe put that proposal back to your people, lead them in this direction so that they may see that there is hope. And we'll talk about that word hope in just a little while as well. So marker number 3 is blank slate Christianity. Now, if you're following me, blank slate receptivity, I should say. Marker number 1 is 20 to 30% are gone. Marker number 2, another 15% another 15% are now once a monthers only. And number 3, this is a good news type of thing, and it's blank slate receptivity. In other words, many church members are ready and are receptive to change. Marker number 4. This is not, you may say, now, how is this related to the post-pandemic, the post-quarantine era? Let me go in and give you marker number 4, and then we'll come back to this. Marker number 4 is a lower birth rate. What? What does that have to do with the pandemic? Well, give me just a moment. Going into 2020, the worldwide birth rate, there are some exceptions, and Africa, the continent of Africa is one of the most glaring exceptions, but worldwide, the birth rate had been declining precipitously. In North America in particular, the birth rate was half of what it used to be just 20 years earlier. And many people thought that maybe during the quarantine that there would be a reevaluation, and while people are at home, that there would be the opportunity for more kids to be born, but it's not happening. As 2020 has passed, and if you look for when we went into quarantine, for many people it would have been probably around March 1, 2020, somewhere in that era. Now into December, which would have been 9 months later, and then to January, February, and now where we are, guess what? The birth rate has declined even more. Even though couples were at home more, even though you would think that this may be a reevaluation of the desire to have family. What we have seen during the pandemic is a decline in birth rates that has been exacerbated. In other words, it hasn't turned around. It is worse than it used to be, and it still seems to be holding at this low birth rate. Again, Thom, what does that have to do with the quarantine? What does that have to do with these markers? Well, think for a moment about the sources of numerical growth for a church. There is conversion growth, seeing people come to faith in Christ. There's biological growth, when people have children and they then start attending church. There is transfer growth when they move from one church to another. You get it. Those are the sources of growth. Well, here's what we know. Conversion growth has been declining precipitously. We'll come back to that in a moment. Transfer growth, primarily cultural Christians moving from one church to another, has declined significantly. That leaves us one type of growth that may be a possibility in this biological growth, higher birth rate, but that's not either. So the 3 primary buckets of growth, conversion growth, transfer growth, and biological growth, are all going down. Now, once again, I will conclude this by coming back to this issue of conversion growth, because I see when we look at the possibility that 2 other sources of growth are no longer largely available, it may encourage us to look at the possibility of being more evangelistic and reaching people with the gospel. Okay, let me pause for a moment. Post-quarantine church, 4 markers. Marker number 1, 20 to 30% are gone. Marker number 2, another 15% have moved to once a month attendance. Marker number 3, which I think is a good one, blank slate receptivity to change, or just call it the blank slate for simplicity. Marker number 4, a lower birth rate. Okay, those are the 4 markers. Now, there are more, obviously. I shouldn't say those are I should say those are 4 of the markers, 4 of the more common markers, okay? Now, let's go from the 4 markers to the 4 approaches to leading from the inside out. So we could simply call this 4 leadership approaches. And I absolutely love each and every one of these because it's going to take us back to the Word. It's going to take us back to truth. And it's, I think, the true biblical way to look at leading a church. Let's look at the 4 markers, and I'll go back to Acts 2:42 through 24. First of all, let's just read. Let me read verse 42 once more. All the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the sharing of meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. All the believers devoted themselves. That word devoted connotes a ravenous beast that is seeing its prey in front of him and is ready to devour the prey. All the believers were ready to devour the teaching of the apostles, which ultimately will become our New Testament. And they also, of course, had the Old Testament teachings as well. They devoured fellowship, including the Lord's Supper, and they were devouring prayer. Now, what we are seeing for many churches coming out of the pandemic is a heightened awareness and an increased desire for greater prayer. Now, we know that individuals pray on their own. Some do more than others. Some do less than others. Some are more obedient to prayer. Some aren't. But we know that people pray on their own. But when I say prayer in this context, I'm talking about the gathered church praying. I love what our church does. My son, Jess, is my pastor. The church is 5 years old. And from day one, he has made prayer a part of the corporate service. And it's not just some type of a recited prayer. It's not just something that goes through routine or rote. It is a time when we pray together. Some people may gather at the front. Some people may gather with friends. Some people are just more comfortable praying where they are in their chair. But we pause, and there will actually be prayer needs put on the screen so people can look up. Our family members will be praying together. It is a powerful time. It has been a time that has been extraordinary toward the health of our church. What we're seeing is a greater emphasis on praying. One of the ministries that we have at Church Answers is a ministry called Pray and Go. You can go to prayandgochurch.com. I think that is right. And look at this ministry. And my wife and I, as I'm recording this, we actually participated in Pray and Go a week ago. And what we did is we took some flyers or some door hangers, and we started walking in a neighborhood that had been assigned to us. And I didn't stop. I would just begin to walk slowly by a particular church, house. And when I went by that house, I would pray. And I just say, God bless the people here in this home for whatever their needs may be, especially those spiritual needs, but bless them. And I would take the door hanger and I would go put it on their door. And I'd walk away and I'd go to the next home. I never stopped. If there were people in the yard, especially kids, I did not go there for obvious reasons. If there were dogs, I did not go there, but there was very few of them. I probably hit 90 to 95% of the homes that were on my schedule route. And my wife and I just went door to door. We didn't knock on the door. We didn't confront anyone. We just prayed. And it's been amazing to watch this Pray and Go happen in churches. I know of one church in Florida that had about 3,000 homes for which they prayed in a very short time, and they were in a large church. Prayer is becoming more important because you know why? We can't depend upon human power anymore. We should have never depended upon human power, but we certainly cannot do it anymore. And the pandemic has been a wake-up call for us to lead from the inside out with the power of prayer. The first thing the Jerusalem church did was they devoted themselves to what? The apostles' teaching, which is obviously our Bible today, to fellowship, to gathering, and to what? Prayer. And I don't think it's incidental nor accidental that the Holy Spirit led Luke in this chapter, in this pericope in Acts, to put prayer at the end of this sentence. It's like it is the pinnacle. And they devoted themselves to prayer. If you're going to be that type of post-quarantine church that is leading from the inside out, you must be a leader in prayer. And one of the things that we're seeing is an incipient and growing prayer movement among churches. And let me remind you once again that I am speaking of the church gathered praying or the church going praying. Yes, there's individual prayers and there's individual prayers, but this is about the church together praying. Prayer is one of the ways that we lead from the inside out. The second one is so obvious it probably does not need mentioning. In fact, that's true for all of these. And that is evangelism. I mentioned earlier that we really can't count on biological growth for attendance growth in our churches. We can't count on transfer growth. And the reality of it is we shouldn't be counting on those types of growth. Certainly we rejoice when new babies are born. Certainly we like it when people are coming from another church to ours if it's for a good biblical reason. But our primary source of growth should be what Christ commanded us to do in Matthew 28 and Acts 1:8. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, or Acts 1:8, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Evangelism is what we're supposed to be doing. And what we're seeing in the pandemic is evangelism is being enhanced because some of it is a bit pragmatic, I would admit. There's no other way to grow, no significant way to grow. But a lot of it is just how the people are sensing that it's time to be obedient. And I would encourage all of you in this post-quarantine era to start asking the question, how can we lead from the inside out? If you're not leading to lead people to Christ, you're not leading biblically, because that is the essence of what Christ said when he ascended, before he ascended, that you will be my witnesses, beginning where you are and then in concentric circles beyond. Prayer, evangelism. This third one is taken on a heightened meaning, gathering, in-person gathering. Now, understand clearly, digital gathering has been good for the church. I am not one of those old fuddy-duddies who simply says, well, that's not really gathering. It was a godsend for us to be able to have these streaming services, to have Zoom community groups or Sunday school classes, whatever you may call them. It was a godsend. We could not meet in person, so we had the opportunity to meet digitally. And many churches held on because of those digital types of meetings. But the in-person gathering is taking on a new importance in this post-quarantine era. And for certain, it was already important in the early church. And all the believers, verse 44, and all the believers met together. Verse 46, they worshiped together. This together word was very powerfully present in the first church. Their coming together was critical. And quite frankly, I think before the quarantine, most church members and leaders minimized this gathering. I have a book coming out in 2022 called Where Have All the Church Members Gone? I actually wrote it before the pandemic, and then I updated it for the pandemic and the post-quarantine era. And it's all about the gathered church and how we have minimized it. We don't even think in many of our churches about gathering being a spiritual discipline, worship gathering. Again, to be repetitive, we think about prayer and fasting and reading the Bible and other spiritual disciplines, but we don't think about gathering as a spiritual discipline. Gathering is a spiritual discipline. And it is one way that we begin to lead from the inside out. We have new member classes that have high expectations that you are a part of the gathered church. We stop fussing at culture because they're taking away our people on Sunday. Sure, there's sports leagues. Sure, there's a lot of people taking multiple vacations a year and sleeping in. But you know why? It's not that culture has attacked us. It is because the church has surrendered to culture. If we would take a stand and say that church is important, now understand there's some people who medical workers and others who cannot be there on Sunday morning. I'm not being that hard-nosed, but simply to say, for the most part, we have not talked about how important the gathered church is. We have not acted out how important the gathered church is. And in essence, through our silence and our lack of actions, what we as church leaders and church members have said is that church is just another activity. Gathering is just another thing to do. And if it's just another thing to do, you can choose sleep that morning, or you can choose going out of town without going to a church in the area where you are. What we are seeing in this post-quarantine era is a revolution, a renewal of how important it is to gather. I love what's happened in my community group. Community group is the name that we call our small groups at our church. And we're the only adult group that meets on Sunday morning. Now, there's a reason for that. There's only one room available in our church to meet on Sunday morning. We don't have many spaces, so the rest of the groups have to meet throughout the week, either at the church or in their home or somewhere else. But we meet on Sunday morning. They let us do it because we're the senior adults. In fact, I'm the second oldest person in this church. And I love what we've been able to do. We've been able to take the best of the digital world and the best of the gathered. And essentially, here's what we say. We say there's absolutely no reason for you to miss church on any given day. You can come to our community group, which is 8 o'clock, digitally or in person. You can worship digitally or in person. Or if you're out of town, you can attend another church in person. We have that emphasis. And what does that mean? We are emphasizing gathering. So how do you lead from the inside out? A renewed and powerful spirit-led emphasis on prayer. How do you lead inside out? Number 2, it is a renewal of obedience to the Great Commission. How do you lead inside out? Gather. In person, worship, gathering. And they were together. The 4th of these ways that we lead from inside out is we provide hope. We are not in a hopeless time. God does not dwell in a hopeless time if you are a believer in Christ. There is always hope in Christ. And it's not always just eschatological or heaven-bound hope. There's hope while we are still living here. And we have gone through this time where there's been great tension, political tension, economic tension. There's been church tension, fights over, do you wear a mask or take them off? Do you social distance or not? Do you open the doors or keep them closed? And it's been horrendous how that has torn so many churches apart. We're seeing a change take place as we lead from the inside out. We're seeing more and more church leaders provide the message of hope that is found in Jesus Christ. It is not just something practical to do, as practical as it may be, but as we begin to articulate that message of hope for people in our churches, it gives them a greater desire to what? Number 1, pray. Number 2, to be evangelistic. And number 3, gather. And then they have greater hope. The business world, I'm not trying to imitate the business world, but in the business world, they call this the flywheel. You get one thing going, you add to another, and then it begins to spin on itself. You become a praying church. You become more evangelistic. You gather more, there's greater hope. If there's greater hope, you pray more, you're more evangelistic, and you gather more. And the flywheel continues to spin. You see, I am an obnoxious optimist about the local church. I truly believe that we are headed into a time where we're going to see a lot of churches. We'll see what the definition of a lot is going into the future. But we're going to see many, many churches headed into the future where they are going to have some of their best days in their history. They're going to have a renewed emphasis on prayer. They're going to be reaching people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. They're going to be gathering faithfully. And through this all, they will have a message of hope. 4 markers, 4 ways from leading inside out. Remember the markers. Some of it's tough news. 20 to 30% of those who are here in 2019 are gone. Second one is tough. 15% of the people are now have moved to once a month when they were more frequent before that. The third marker is pretty good news. There's a blank slate. There's a receptivity to change. And the fourth marker is a lower birth rate and the implications of that upon churches, and particularly our church and your church. But remember the ways that we lead from the inside out: prayer, evangelism, gathering, and hope. And as you are leading in this post-quarantine era, as you are here in this appointed time that God has given, you are to be that leader of prayer, that leader of evangelism, that leader of gathering, that leader of hope. Just a little anecdote to kind of end this time with you. One of the things our church has been encouraged to do by my son, the pastor, and by others is to pray for opportunities. So we're combining praying and we're combining evangelism. And we're praying for opportunities to share the gospel and also to just simply invite people to church. Should have had it. I usually carry it in this pocket, an invitation card where if I have the opportunity, I'm able to hand it to someone. Well, my wife and I went out to eat not too long ago, and Christians are sometimes notorious about leaving a tract but not leaving a tip. Well, that wasn't the whole purpose here. I'd just been praying for an opportunity to be able to share the gospel, or at the very least, to invite someone to church. Well, the young lady's name was Gabby, and my wife and I were eating, and I am such an introvert. I mean, you put me in a corner with my nose facing the wall, and I'm happy. That's how I am. But I know I have to be. Introversion is not an excuse for disobedience. And so as she was serving us, I said, she introduced her name, and I said, now tell me your name again. And she said, it's Gabby. And I then took it to the next step. My wife's seen me have these kind of conversations, and she knows it's difficult for me to do this, but I did anyway. So I said, Gabby, where do you live? And she said, well, I live in Franklin. I live in Franklin, Tennessee. So she's living in my hometown. And I was hoping that a lot of people work in Franklin, but they live in Spring Hill, Tennessee, that is south. And I was hoping she'd say Spring Hill because we're going to invite her to our church, at the church at Spring Hill. We actually traveled 20 miles south to go to my son's church. And but that opportunity did not arise. She doesn't live in Spring Hill, so I thought to myself, that's okay. But then she paused for a moment, and she said, "But I'm only here 2 more weeks. I'm moving to Bradenton, Florida." My eyes went open wide. I'm in Franklin, Tennessee, and this young lady says that she is moving to Bradenton, Florida. And you don't have a clue what I'm talking about right now, unless you've ever heard me talk. My oldest son is a pastor in Bradenton, Florida. And not only that, she said she's getting married, and she and her husband are going to move to Bradenton, Florida. I said, do you have a job there yet? And she said, yeah. I'm going to continue serving for now. I just finished my college degree, but for now, just to earn some extra income, I'm going to continue being a server in a restaurant. And so I've already got a job in a restaurant. I said, what restaurant is that, Gabby? She said, Pier 22. Now, you don't know what that means either, but it's my family and my son's family's favorite restaurant. It's walking distance from our home in Bradenton, Florida. And so I was able to invite her to church. I was able to have a short gospel presentation with her. And I was just able to do something just because this introvert had prayed for an opportunity. Well, I wish I could tell you that I know for certain that Gabby's a follower of Christ. I can't, but I can tell you that she definitely made some steps forward. And she actually wrote down the information of the church, my son's cell phone number, which he always gives me permission to give out. I don't just do it without his permission. It's kind of a blanket permission. And I'm hoping that she'll connect there, and I hope she'll become a true dedicated follower of Christ, as well as her new husband, as well as other people with whom we have contact. What's my point in telling you that story? My point in telling you that story is that kind of story is being repeated again and again and again. I know I kind of made myself the hero of that, but the reality of it is it's happening with many people. Certainly, we live in a post-quarantine era that is different than the pre-quarantine era anytime in our own lives. And certainly there has been devastation and churches have been hurt. And certainly there are challenges still ahead. but I've never known a challenge in Scripture that God was not up to. I've never known a challenge for you today that God is not up to. So yes, we're in a post-quarantine time, but let's begin to lead from the inside outward with the powerful power of prayer, with the true gospel through evangelism, with the dedication to gather and be committed to gather, and with the hope that only comes through Jesus Christ. Take this era, this new era, the post-quarantine era, and ask God what he can do through you and your church. I say it not flippantly. I say it because I mean it with all my heart. The best days of your church could be right ahead. Thank you. God bless you.